The palace of Solomon, the house of 1,000 souls. Before there were kingdoms of marble, before there were empires crowned in gold, there was a king whose wisdom and wealth would shake the world. A man who spoke with God and yet, in the quiet halls of his own palace, would come to face the greatest test of all, the weight of his own heart. His name was Solomon, and what he built was not just a palace. It was a statement to heaven and earth, a monument of light, stone, and gold, meant to reflect the glory of God, yet destined to reveal the fragility of man. Introduction. When people think of royal castles, they imagine the towering spires of fairy tales. Disney princesses waiting for love, marble floors polished to perfection, walls gleaming in the sun. But Solomon's palace was no dream from a storybook. It was real, and it was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. In the heart of Jerusalem, surrounded by dry hills and sun-cracked earth, stood a fortress of faith and splendor. It was said that in those days, silver was as common as stones on the street, and gold flowed like rivers through the king's treasury. There were 1,000 women within those walls, 700 wives, 300 concubines, each from a different kingdom, each bringing her own culture, her gods, her language. Egyptians, Moabites, Ammonites, Sidonians, all dwelling together under one king. And for them, Solomon built separate houses, because this was no ordinary home. It was a kingdom within a kingdom, a living symbol of peace and power. But behind the glory of its golden halls lay a question that still echoes through the ages. How could the wisest man who ever lived, a man who spoke with the Almighty, build the greatest house on earth and still lose the temple within his heart? The vision and the power. The Bible tells us that Solomon spent 7 years building the temple of God, the dwelling place of the divine presence, but 13 years building his own palace. At first, it sounds almost troubling. How could a man chosen by God devote nearly twice as long to his own comfort as to the Lord's holy dwelling? But when you understand what he was building, the picture becomes clear. This was not simply a residence. It was a complex, an architectural declaration of divine favor and royal authority. Every stone that formed its walls had been cut with precision, measured, and polished before ever being brought to Jerusalem. The foundations were made of massive blocks, some over 4 meters long, carved and fitted without the sound of hammer or chisel near the site, because no tool of iron was to be heard where the king's house rose. Between the layers of stone were beams of cedar imported from Lebanon, fragrant and strong, the same cedar once used to build the temple itself. Line upon line, stone upon cedar, strength upon beauty. The palace was not only a home, it was a message to every kingdom around, that the God of Israel had blessed his servant beyond measure, and that Solomon's reign was unshakable. The atmosphere of glory. Imagine walking through its gates. The air is dry, yet filled with the scent of cedar wood. Light pours through high square windows, washing over golden shields that hang upon the walls. 500 of them, pure gold, untouched by war, gleaming in perfect rows. Every corner, every shadow seems alive with purpose. This was a house of the forest of Lebanon, named so because its 45 cedar columns rose like trees in a forest. A hall so vast, so perfectly proportioned, that entering it must have felt like stepping into a man-made Eden, a reflection of paradise built with human hands. When foreign kings came to visit Solomon, this was where they stood in awe. The light struck the gold reflected upon the cedar, and the whole chamber shimmered with the warmth of the sun. It was intimidation wrapped in beauty, a silent sermon that said, "Here dwells a man blessed beyond kings." And yet, the more gold filled the halls, the more questions filled the heavens. The paradox of wisdom. Solomon's story is not simply about grandeur, it's about contrast. He was a man who asked God for wisdom and received it in abundance. He wrote songs, proverbs, and spoke of trees and beasts with the knowledge of a scholar. But wisdom alone does not guard the heart. For every alliance he forged, Solomon took a wife, not out of lust, but out of strategy. Each marriage meant peace with another kingdom. Each peace treaty brought new trade, new wealth, new gods. And slowly, the palace that once echoed with psalms of praise began to fill with whispers of other names. Names of idols, names of gods from distant lands. Altars began to rise, not just for the Lord, but for Chemosh, Molech, and Ashtoreth. The king who built the temple of the one true God was now building shrines to the gods of his wives. And in the eyes of heaven, the richest man alive became the poorest of all, a house of glory and a test of the soul. Inside the royal court stood the hall of judgment, where Solomon's throne shone brighter than the sun itself. It was made of ivory, overlaid with pure gold. 14 lions, 2 beside the throne, 12 upon its 6 steps, guarded the way. When Solomon sat to judge, men trembled, not because of the lions or the gold, but because his wisdom could see into the heart. It was here that he solved the case of the 2 mothers and the living child, a story that became a symbol of divine justice itself. But justice, like faith, requires balance, and the balance began to shift. Because with every new shipment of gold, with every new alliance sealed by marriage, the voice that once spoke to Solomon grew quieter. The palace grew louder, with music, laughter, and the sound of foreign tongues, while the whisper of God became distant, faint, almost forgotten. Transition to the next part, the body. As the years passed, Solomon's world became a paradox wrapped in beauty, a palace built for the glory of God that slowly became a monument to human desire. The scriptures say that each year, 666 talents of gold, over 23,000 kilograms, flowed into Solomon's treasury. The same number that one day would symbolize the corruption of man appeared first, not as evil, but as abundance. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all, that what begins as a blessing can, without humility, become a burden too heavy for the soul to bear. In the next part of this story, we'll walk to the golden corridors of that palace, to see what the world called paradise and what heaven saw as a warning. The gold and the shadow. Voiceover. The transformation was subtle, like the slow creep of shadow across a sun-drenched floor. Think about it. A man of unparalleled wisdom, the one who stood before God and asked only for an understanding heart, now finds himself drowning in the very opulence he created. The king, who penned the timeless wisdom of Proverbs, "Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life," was failing to guard his own. Remember that number? 666 talents of gold a year, more than 23 tons. It's a number that echoes in history, a symbol often associated with the ultimate temptation, the seduction of the world, and it was the annual income of God's chosen king. This wasn't just wealth. It was a psychological phenomenon. When silver is considered as common as stones in Jerusalem, when every piece of cutlery, every shield, is pure gold, you lose perspective. Your world becomes so saturated with luxury that the spiritual, the intangible, the simple relationship with God starts to feel dull. Solomon's heart, once a perfectly tuned instrument dedicated to the Almighty, was becoming a crowded marketplace. The broken vows and foreign flames. Voiceover. We talk about the 1,000 women, a staggering number that often distracts us from the deeper crisis. These weren't just romantic entanglements. They were strategic alliances. Solomon was building his empire not through war, but through weddings. Every bride was a peace treaty, every dowry a political guarantee. It seemed brilliant, a pragmatic path to world dominance. But God had warned Israel. Back in Deuteronomy, long before any king sat on the throne, the law was clear. The king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. It was a divine speed bump, a protective barrier put in place because God knows the human heart better than we do. He knew that marrying the princess meant accepting her culture, her gods, her influence. And Solomon, the wisest man, failed the simplest test of obedience. He didn't just allow his wives to worship their deities. He built them places to do it. Imagine standing on the Mount of Olives, looking down at the holy city. On one hill, the glorious temple of the one true God, his presence, his spirit. And then on the adjacent hills, smoking altars dedicated to Chemosh, the Moabite god of destruction, and Moloch, the Ammonite deity infamous for child sacrifice. The sight must have been heartbreaking, a spiritual slap in the face to every faithful Israelite. The king of Israel, the steward of God's covenant, had desecrated the very land he swore to protect. The price of peace, God's judgment. Voiceover. God is patient, but he is also righteous. He didn't abandon Solomon immediately. The Bible tells us that the Lord appeared to Solomon not just once, but twice. The first time was at Gibeon, at the beginning of his reign, confirming his wisdom and blessing the temple. The second time, it was after Solomon's heart had turned. It was a confrontation, a heartbroken judgment. God said, "Since this is your conduct, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you, I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant." A stark and terrifying pronouncement. The unified, glorious kingdom, the dream of David, the inheritance of Solomon, would be torn apart. This is a crushing truth. Solomon's wisdom was a gift, but his obedience was a choice. And in the end, his choices, the gold, the wives, the foreign gods, undid the gift. The wealth that was meant to be a blessing became a curse. The political strategy that was supposed to ensure peace led to an internal rot that guaranteed civil war. The crumbling foundation and the seeds of division. Voiceover. The cracks began to show almost immediately. First, Hadad the Edomite rose up. He was a young survivor from David's brutal conquest of Edom, who had fled to Egypt, married into Pharaoh's family, and now returned as a royal, vengeful enemy, constantly harassing the southern border. Then came Rezin, son of Eliada, a Syrian military leader who seized Damascus and ruled Aram, becoming another thorn in Israel's side, constantly raiding and disrupting the peace Solomon had so carefully constructed. But the most dangerous threat was domestic, rising up from within Solomon's own ranks. Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Jeroboam was a competent, energetic young man, whom Solomon himself had recognized and promoted, putting him in charge of all the forced labor of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. He was a man of the people, an ambitious administrator, and he saw the corruption, the opulence, and the spiritual compromise in Jerusalem. One day, as Jeroboam was traveling out of the city, the prophet Ahijah met him on the road. Ahijah tore his own new cloak into 12 pieces, the number of the tribes of Israel, and gave 10 of them to Jeroboam. This wasn't a mere political gesture. It was a divine prophecy, a dramatic announcement of the kingdom's doom. The 10 pieces represented the 10 northern tribes that God was about to rip from Solomon's son's grasp. The one tribe left, Judah, plus Benjamin, would remain only for the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city where God had chosen to put his name. Think about the weight of that moment. The kingdom, built on the promise to David, guaranteed by the wisdom of Solomon, was now being divided by God himself as punishment for the king's infidelity. Solomon, the all-powerful, all-seeing king, tried to kill Jeroboam to stop the prophecy. Jeroboam fled to Egypt, the irony of which is thick. The king of Israel was driving out the future leader of Israel, forcing him to take refuge in a land of slavery. The man who asked for an understanding heart ended his life with a murderous, desperate political maneuver. The brilliant, magnificent reign of Solomon wasn't ending with a whimper. It was ending with a terrifying rumble of judgment. Voiceover. The king's final years were consumed by anxiety, by the echoes of foreign worship on the hills, and by the certain knowledge that his immense effort, the temple, the palaces, the gold, the peace, was all about to unravel. When Solomon finally passed away and his son Rehoboam took the throne, the tension Jeroboam left behind was a ticking time bomb. The stage was set for a confrontation that would forever redefine the history of God's people. A grand, unified kingdom built on faith and gold was about to shatter. The palace of Solomon, the fall and the light, the weight of gold. As the years rolled on, Solomon's palace grew silent. The laughter of his courts faded into whispers. The fragrance of cedar turned to the scent of incense burned for gods that were not his own. The great king, the wisest man who ever lived, had become a prisoner within his own creation. The same gold that once symbolized blessing now glimmered like chains around his soul. Every corner of the palace told a story. Walls once shining with the glory of the Lord now echoed the footsteps of priests who no longer prayed to him. Altars that were meant for worship now stood beside shrines of compromise. The palace, that living symbol of divine favor, had become a house divided, and no house divided can stand. The silence of heaven. There came a time when the voice of God, once clear and intimate, became silent to Solomon. The man who once heard divine wisdom in his dreams could no longer find peace in his sleep. He had everything, wisdom, wealth, women, power, and yet He felt nothing. It's one of the most haunting truths in Scripture, that you can build everything on the outside, temples, palaces, kingdoms, and still lose the sanctuary within your heart. Solomon began to write again, not psalms of glory, but words of sorrow and searching. In the quiet of his later years, he penned the book of Ecclesiastes, a confession wrapped in poetry. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 14. Here was a man who had tasted everything the world could offer and found it hollow. The palace that once symbolized triumph had become a mirror of the soul, vast, beautiful, and echoing with emptiness. The turning of the heart. But God, in his mercy, never left him. Though Solomon had strayed, the covenant remained. And in the final years of his reign, something remarkable began to stir within him. Not the building of walls, but the rebuilding of a heart. The Scriptures don't give us every detail, but the evidence whispers between the lines. The old king, weary and repentant, began to remember. He looked back upon the years of peace, the temple he had once built for the Lord, and the word spoken by his father David. Serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of thoughts. 1 Chronicles 28 verse 9. And slowly, like dawn after a long night, Solomon began to understand. The true temple was never made of stone or gold. It was, and always would be, the human heart devoted to God. The lesson of the palace. The story of Solomon's palace is not simply about architecture or wealth. It's a mirror reflecting both the majesty of human creation and the fragility of human devotion. In its stones, we see ambition. In its gold, we see blessing. In its fall, we see warning. And in Solomon's repentance, we see grace. Because even the wisest man can fall, but no one is beyond the reach of redemption. That is the mystery of divine love, that God does not abandon his children when they wander. He waits, he calls, and when they turn back, he welcomes them, not to a palace of gold, but to a kingdom of mercy, the echo of eternity. Centuries later, another king would walk upon the earth, one greater than Solomon. He, too, would speak of temples and kingdoms, but his words would pierce deeper. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. John 2 verse 19. He was not speaking of stone walls, but of his own body, a living temple that no power on earth could destroy. Where Solomon's palace fell to ruin, Christ became the everlasting house of God among men. And in him, the cycle of pride and fall was finally broken. In him, we find what Solomon sought all his life, wisdom not of man, but of heaven, peace not of politics, but of the soul. The message for us today. Perhaps that is why Solomon's story endures, not as a tale of failure, but as a living sermon. It reminds us that success without surrender is hollow, that knowledge without obedience leads to confusion, and that faith without humility is fragile. We live in a world still building palaces of wealth, fame, technology, pride. But the lesson of Solomon calls across the centuries. Before you build outward, make sure your heart is built upon the rock. Because the truest riches are not found in gold, but in grace. And the most beautiful palace is the one God builds within us, brick by brick, through forgiveness, faith, and love. The final reflection. As the sun set over ancient Jerusalem, the palace of Solomon glowed in the evening light. Its golden rooftops shimmered like fire. But within those walls, the king sat in silence, staring toward the temple, the place where heaven once touched earth. And perhaps, in that stillness, he whispered the words that have guided countless souls since. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Ecclesiastes 12 verse 13. In the end, that was the wisdom of Solomon. Not the glory of his crown, not the splendor of his palace, but the rediscovery of his creator. Closing narration, voiceover suggestion. Soft choir fades and warm light transitions on screen. From the dust of Israel's hills to the courts of eternity, the story of Solomon reminds us the greatest kingdom a man can ever build is not made of stone, but of surrender. And when that kingdom belongs to God, it will never fall.